So you need the Manchester. We've got Manchester. Hopefully, got another Sheffield. So someone.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the IHL Digital History Seminar. This evening it's our pleasure to have a workshop, which is something I think we've just decided. We had our conveners meeting this afternoon and decided we're going to do more of these kind of things. So thank you for the inspiration to do them during normal seminar times as opposed to doing them at separate times. This evening we're delighted to welcome Katrina Navickas, who's a Regent of History at the University of Hertfordshire, and Sam Griffiths, not Sam Smith, who is a lecturer in spatial cultures at the Bartlett School of Architecture. And they're going to run us through the applying space syntax methods to finding, well, I guess the distances between places of meeting in the 19th century. We do have a live stream running this evening, and I'll be moving the camera around at different points to point at relevant parts of it. So we may have one or two people online who are following along. As part of that process, we are going to spend some of this time having a bit of an introduction, some of this time working, and some of this time concluding. So those who are online will have less a chance to interact when we have bits of paper in front of us than those who are merely watching along at the start. Okay, I'll hand over to Katrina and Sam.
Right. Thank you. Okay,
turn things around.
Yeah. Okay, so welcome. This is the result of a quite long process of interdisciplinary collaboration. So if you don't know me, I'm a historian. Sam is also a historian, but you're also working within an architectural framework. And we also have various collaborators, Dino, who we're hoping will be along later, who works at Bartlett, and previous collaborator Panos, who is more of a GIS expert. So this is an exploration, it's a work in progress. It's we're hoping to take you through some of the processes that we've gone through, starting with some historical data and mapping, and then so far. So some of you might have known my earlier work with British Library Project, where I was extracting data from digitised newspapers. This is where I've gone with it, and in new unexpected directions. And Sam has been brilliant in terms of giving me new ideas about what we can do with this data as historians using digital methods. We'll also introduce you to Depth Map, which is the software that is used to basically visualise some of the principles that we're talking about. We're not going to provide any solid conclusions because actually our emphasis today is on the process and what we're learning through the process, and hopefully might inspire you to think about your data in new ways and visualising your data. This is what we've been doing, really. What are our research questions? What are our methods? So we're going to talk for about 20 minutes on our the starting point for this project and some of the basic principles of space syntax. Then we'll work on the paper copies, the maps, and basically Sam described it earlier as having a conversation with the maps, see what we'd like to actually know what you think of what we're producing and where we can go with these maps, particularly comparing the two cities. So our case studies are Manchester and Sheffield in the 19th century. But there's some basic principles that we think are applicable to any sort of mapping that you might be doing. And then, yeah, I think we'll start with basic principles. This is where I started, which is with the OS maps from 1849, Manchester. And what we're doing essentially isn't new. People have always thought about thinking about patterns in the city. So Engels is the basic example we're starting with here, but we quite like this quotation. We quite like his approach. You might not agree with his conclusions, but actually he's one of the people at the time of our data set that is thinking about the city as a pattern, as a morphology. So he's looking at places that we're examining, such as the new town in Manchester, which is now the trendy, fashionable Northern Quarter, as a pattern of thinking about the materiality of the place, which in 1849, the time of the first detailed OS map, has rapidly expanded. The population has doubled, tripled each census since 1801. This is Berta, right on cue, who's done some of the wonderful mapping that we're going to present to you. Do you want to sit there? So, in the condition of the working class in England in 1844, Engels is describing what he can see, and essentially that's part of the principles of all urban historians and all architects and people working with geographical data, is basically say what you see and think about patterns, materiality in the street plans. So this isn't a new process, but his way of formulating what he thinks about the city is subjective, obviously, but it's also thinking about the material. Is there anything else you want to say about that quotation, Sam?
Well, I suppose the starting point is for me is that in that passage, Engels talks about labyrinthine qualities and mazes and things in quite a figurative sense. But I suppose I'm kind of interested in actually the fact that he found some sort of social order in this arrangement and how we can do a better job of describing and investigating and exploring that.
Okay, so the next obvious reference point in the 19th century are the Booth maps, which are later Victorian social investigations into poverty in London. And again, thinking about mapping and categorising street systems in relation both to their materiality, what their physical condition, and it's gone, and to thinking about spatial structure. So this is the kind of cleaned up version of Booth maps. He categorised, again, subjectively, the different areas of poverty in London, from the lowest class to the well-to-do. And so this is as a representation by Laura Vaughan, who's also at the Bartlett, just sort of cleaning his social maps up in a particular area of the East End of London, and thinking about how do we categorise spatial morphologies, how do we work through different areas and think about how the city is formulated.
Again, I think it poses a question that there's a pattern or a structure or something you can see there. So again, we think, can we find a formal way of describing that in terms of the street morphology?
Okay. And yeah, so historical geographers are obviously the next reference point from the 20th century, who again are thinking about how do we use maps and patterns to think about the cityscape and social data, basically. So this is from Colin Pooley's work, Getting to Know the City. Again, urban historians are very accomplished in this. But Sam, do you want to say what really intrigued you about this particular representation?
Well, I mean, the quotation which comes from the Cambridge Urban History of Britain, I mean, just almost the statement of kind of defeat after, I found very interesting for someone who devoted a career to exactly that question. And here in this wonderful work, I think, looking at sort of urban diaries, this idea of spatial knowledge, it is still interesting the human action is imposed on a vacuum, on a kind of, on a white space. And we don't really know, I think, very well how to describe how those kind of patterns, those dots, actually what they have to do with the lived spaces of the city and how we can think about them in those terms.
Okay, so that's where we've got to in terms of our evolution of thinking about space. So now we're going to introduce you to where we get to in terms of space syntax. So the inset map is Booth's map, an extract from the original, and this is again, Lord Vaughan's work on the Booth maps and trying to think about them in a spatial sense. And she's made space syntax analysis of the Booth maps. And we'll explain what the basic principles of that in a minute. But Sam, do you want to say something about what you've done with this slide?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the basic point here, you can run with us for now, is that the coloured diagram there, against the black background, is a kind of a network representation of 19th century London, and the redder the line, the more of a busy or a main street you might expect to be, the more integrated that line is in the system, and the bluer it is, the more disconnected it is. So, what Laura did was take her kind of representation of the Booth map and sit the one on the other and say, how can the Booth's descriptions of poverty be explained in terms of urban structures so far as a mapping exercise? And the statistics there on the right sort of show you that pretty much the more integration in the system, the better connected the line was at that time, the higher the social group that was likely to be a resident there, and ditto at the other end, the more disconnected from the system, not exactly, but kind of approximately, the more likely it was to be a poor area in terms of Booth's classifications.
Okay, so this is where we start with our project, and hopefully this will all sort of make sense now. That was the kind of evolution of where mapping has got to, and now we're going to sort of explore what we're doing with our project. So, as I said, this project is interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, and what we're trying to do is combine historical knowledge, historical data with GIS mapping techniques and space syntax sort of theory and methods. So the benefits of doing this collaboration are that as a historian, we have a lot of deep source knowledge. We know the material, we know the contextual information, we know it as a source. Compare that with geography, we can combine it to use the GIS platforms as a sort of regular systemic way of mapping this data. What space syntax does, drawing from architectural principles, is that it enables you to do iterative analysis that you can build on and compare different models, and linking the spatial structure of a city, as we've just explained and shown you, that cities are structures, they are connected, they have well-connected areas and more disparate areas. How do you map that using software? And think about the connection between that sort of material aspects of the city with the social elements that you get from historical data. So that's where we see the connection. So we're using GIS and depth map to visualize our data and combine the two together. There are some problems that we've got to overcome, and hopefully by combining those three fields we can overcome those. With history, obviously, our main data is textual. There, if you've seen my presentations before, I work a lot with the digitized newspapers. So the first raw data that I extracted was from Chartist newspapers. So the Chartists were the democracy movement in the 19th century, and they listed all their meeting sites in the papers. So I was working mainly with text and doing text mining to extract that data, and that's the project I did with the British Library. So essentially you're still working a lot with textual data, even though we have historic maps. The main contextual methods that historians use are working with text and interpreting text. That's a good thing in terms of the social context, less good if you're trying to plug it into software. So there's some refining that you've got to do there. Again, I'm just going to go back and remind myself. Yeah, historians are not very good at understanding maps, though. We don't do geography. I mean, when I was at school, you did history or geography, you didn't do both, which is why, again, this has been quite experimental for me. So historians generally are not comfortable with using maps in different ways and trying to understand them, which is part of the purpose of the workshop today is to give you some more tools to do so. So that's one of the things that we hope to overcome. GIS we found, particularly working with ArcGIS, is that it likes to be neat and tidy, and that doesn't often correlate with the untidy history it provides. We don't have complete records of everything, and a lot of the data that we do have, digitized stuff, is incomplete. So GIS tends to sort of have error messages a lot in terms of when you plug in all this data. So again, we've got to think about how do you explain the gaps in the data as much as what the data shows us. And then with the architecture of the space syntax, it tends to be a bit abstract in terms of its theories, its methods, which is why, again, I think that historians and even geographers haven't engaged with it as much, because it's dealing with the now and the present. And despite the wonderful work of Lord Vaughan and other members of the Bartlett, actually it's not as well used as perhaps it could be for those sort of abstract reasons. So the GIS data that we extracted, again, just in spreadsheet form, that's just an extract from it. So basically just geolocating the addresses of the meeting sites and sticking the latitude and longitude in the databases. Simple as that. A lot of, again, but that still required me to find a lot of the addresses that don't exist anymore using contemporary maps and finding those locations. So there's a lot of groundwork in terms of digging around. You can't just plug it into Google Maps and it won't find you all the addresses, particularly in areas where there'd been slum clearance, for example. So there's still a lot of historical research needed in terms of locating those addresses. And finally, the space syntax database looks like that's where we're looking at these integration coefficients. So we're looking at lots of different levels, which we won't go into today, that you can read up on all the different measures that you can use. But essentially, we're looking at how well integrated different streets are or different points are. Are they in areas where there are lots of connections? In areas where it's isolated and things aren't connected very well to each other. That's the basic, ultimate basic explanation of what we're aiming for. It ends up looking like that on the actual software. So, Sam, do you want to talk about the software? Here we're going to do a live demo.
Right, okay, so now we go up here, there, and open.
So I must say that DepthMap is free open source. You can download it now if you like.
And to open that,
the link is on the PowerPoint.
Oh. It's just crashed.
It's just crashed.
Oh, we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Oh, hang on. Actually, I think I might be able to get it now. Here we go. Okay. That's just a sort of random noise reference number. What I'm going to do is just create a new column like that, and then hopefully I'm going to just run. I'm going to convert this into an axial map, which is. So the underlying map is basically a street network representation that's been cleaned up so that it's approximately the least and longest number of lines that cover the whole area of the open space. And then that's telling me connectivity, so that red line has got more immediate connections to it than this one, which has far fewer. And then you can have fun running. So if we run N, that's the connect. We ask the computer to look at all of the lines in the system and ask which are relatively closer to all the other lines. And we can do this for various things, and we can produce. So here you would expect, again, this is a completely abstract model, but you would expect the red line here to be a kind of a busy street, a main street. This is a much more localized analysis. It's just looking at lines 2 steps away from each line. So it would pick up sort of more local centers, more local high streets. That's the idea. Now, of course, this is only a mathematical, purely kind of sort of formal representation. So the task then is to kind of make connections with other forms of data. What it gives you is a connection where it proposes as a theory, space syntax proposes that where there is integration, you will have movement and co-presence of people, and if there is no movement or co-presence of people, you will have some kind of social rules explaining that, some sort of cultural conventions explaining that. So it just gives you a basis, a starting point, perhaps, to explore sort of patterns of everyday life, or kind of to kind of link together more sort of fragmented sources of data about what people are doing in streets. Okay.
Does anyone have any questions about this just before we?
Is it based on contemporary street maps or historical street maps? Like if you have a city where the streets have changed dramatically, what do you do?
Well, I mean, the method does depend on having some kind of map or survey or plan. But I mean,
this one's 1849.
That one's, yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, one of the things that's quite nice about syntax is though it can use and is used in its kind of contemporary applications, will use kind of ITN layers or GIS kind of data to produce this sort of stuff. Actually, it comes very much from a sort of tracing paper model. To try to kind of understand how the relation between urban structure and what people did in a kind of sort of contemporary context. So it's you're invited to make these maps yourself, and actually, especially in smaller, sometimes historic urban settings, that's actually quite doable. And in that mapping exercise, you actually start that conversation with the city.
So mathematically, did the work predate the digital?
Yes. I mean, we used to make little sort of text files and take them to the computer science department. Yeah.
But that's good in a way, because it shows there's something that's developed out of a need to kind of mathematically figure out, if not a solution to a problem, then a potential way of thinking about a problem, as opposed to saying, well, here's some data, let's figure it out. Yeah,
no, I think that's right. Absolutely. So I mean, it's actually in a broader sense, the sort of digital era, if you like, is actually opening up a new set of questions for methods that in some way were very analog. And that's a strength, and perhaps in some respects a kind of a source of some sort of anomalies in the method as it is now.
I've played with depth map vaguely in the past. I remember there's a kind of separate mode where you're kind of working with the spaces on a more architectural scale rather than this wireframe of the whole street. Is that something you could expand on?
Yes, I won't. I mean, I won't actually demonstrating it. If you can see, look, if number 4 there, Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In fact, shall I risk it?
Don't blame me.
Okay, and okay, I need to. No, I'm not going to be nice because there are some quite pretty stuff there. It's I could get rid of the grid. It's a bit difficult because is that same grid? No, look, I'm not going to. But yes, I mean, there's, as you can see, that's a whole set of visual meshes, and I mean, it's an open source piece of software. It's not a perfect product, and it's the result of particularly Alistair Turner's, most recently Tassos Varoudis, and other researchers putting their bits into it to drive a particular research project. But you can certainly do buildings level analysis as much as urban scale, and there's a whole set of tools. All of this kind of visibility stuff is particularly sort of has the sort of building and planning.
Is there a kind of continuity though of concept and analysis between those two scales, or are they kind of two approaches?
Oh, no, that's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, basically, there's graph theory underlies both. So one way or another, it's looking at how one space, one node, is related to another, and then sort of analysing the graph. That, as you can see, that's based on a grid, so it carves the plan up into a grid, and then it's about the relationality between the sort of the grids. Whereas the urban model, it's rather than focusing on the junction as the node, actually the space is the node, and the edge is the junction. So there are yeah, I mean, all of this was developed by Alistair Turner. The urban scale stuff was developed by Sheep Dalton and different people. But yes, underlying it is graph theory. Yeah.
Going back to the street graph, I think you said that you were the base was to trace the longest possible route.
Yeah.
How do you deal with segmentation and kind of fractured contiguity when you're looking at a diachronic morphology and a street changes its foundation units and it becomes New Oxford Street rather than Oxford Street? So how do you determine where those junctions come and how they're modeled?
I mean, again, you spend a lot of time doing it. My work, my sort of starter work on this was looking at Sheffield's sort of urban growth between the mid 18th and early 20th century. And I think the answer is yes, you're quite right that say that long, well, any of these lines will cross different street names, and will be, it sort of composites often of different sections of road because it's a like line of sight. Yeah, quite. I mean, I suppose one is that I'm a kind of what I like about this method is that you are on a whole, you put this into the software and you draw lines over the top. So you are asking that sort of question all the time. If you're bringing that knowledge to the process, then it's a very rich process actually, because you're engaging these kind of, you're getting these sort of quantitative descriptions that you might find useful or interesting. Yeah, but I totally take your point. If you would then find someone who knows how to use the software, who then came and drew a map and said, well, I can explain, that you could say, well, no, you can't, because you've got to have the contextual historical knowledge to make this meaningful. And, I think that's why Katrina and I really wanted to do this, because it is powerful at what it does, but yes, it doesn't provide the next explanation. Is that an answer to it? Or?
It is. I think I have practical follow-up. I'll wait till the end and ask.
Or should we just quickly go through that, and then it'll make more sense once we've actually looked at the paper stuff, bizarrely. Can we get back to that?
Yes, I can. Sure.
You all tackle that.
Hang on. There we go. Desktop. I didn't even know I had 4 desktops. Sure, I have 3 now. Hang on. I've got to get the kit. Hang on. It shouldn't be this hard. I did do this a moment ago. All right, we're going to go back to this one. Right, we can just kill depth map actually. Maybe it's underneath.
Not the depth map wants to die.
Right. So make it go away. Right, it is now. Now I think if we go here, that shouldn't have come back.
Yeah, there we are.
Yeah.
Right, so this explains just basically the way that we did it. So quickly, just that we start with the historical OS maps, and I put them in QGIS just because I'm cheap, and then we moved. Then Blitzer here put them in ArcGIS because she's professional. Prepared this space syntax literally by just drawing the lines on the map. So basically, well, not by hand, but using the software. So there isn't a facility need to do that tracing. It's basically tracing on over the contemporary maps. Georeferencing my meetings data, so those spreadsheets. Again, I did a lot of those addresses by hand because of that problem of these streets not existing anymore. And then layering it all together, really, and joining it all together, which seems like a simple process from this diagram, but there are lots of glitches and things that you need to sort out. So we'll go through the process in the latter half of today and show you some of the glitches as well, because one of the things that we want to emphasize is that this isn't a ready-made product. You do need to engage with your own data and mold it to the way that for your own purposes. It's not just a plug and play type of software. It does require a lot of crafting, and we see it as a kind of artisan process actually of crafting it together. And that's what it's starting to look like, and that's some of the handouts that we've given you, mapping. Basically what our research questions are is, what are the patterns we can see by looking at where people met, what types of political meetings happened in the 19th century, and comparing that with the spatial morphology of the urban plan, and changing over time as well is one of our other key questions. So joining them together will help us visualize that, and then we do the next process of thinking about it. That's basically what our so basically it's the GIS data with extra columns of the integration data coming from the depth map software. Meeting names, meeting places. So I'm looking at all types of meetings that happened in the 19th century. So from radical democratic ones, trade union ones, all those different campaigns like the Anti-Corn Law League, Anti-New Poor Law, to loyalist ones, conservative meetings, patriotic meetings, all that kind of thing. Also classifying the different types of meeting sites. So do they happen in a courthouse, in a theatre, in a pub, in an open space on a street? So all that, again, I classified. And then basically doing the space syntax at the end of it. I didn't do any of that, but I did all the fix.
I helped.
Yeah, and Sam did as well, in terms of how integrated those meeting sites are on the urban street plan. So that's what the back end spreadsheet looks like. And we're also comparing it with Sheffield. So the main data is from Manchester. It's the largest data set, but we're building up the data set for Sheffield and trying to think about comparisons between the two and what the meet, and if there's differences between where people met in Sheffield compared with where people met in Manchester. So that's the sort of introduction. I think what we'll do now is actually let you loose on the activity for 15 minutes or so. So what we've given you are two sets of maps. We'll take you through them, I think, and then ask some questions that we'd like you to answer. But the first set of maps, if you've got them, the A4 size ones of Manchester and Sheffield. I haven't copied enough of the old Sheffield maps, apologies. So some of you might have copies of the 1795 map, I think, of Sheffield, which is the grey one. If you haven't got that, apologies. I didn't. Actually, what happened was I double-side printed it. And then we've also got the Manchester one. So if you just take a minute to look at those, basically that's what you start off with. Yeah.
I mean, I think
This is your Sheffield.
Yeah, that's all Sheffield.
so the
Is that Manchester?
the historical maps are the starting point, and the syntactical, the spatial morphological maps were then constructed on the basis of these in a GIS. So if you turn to the page with the dots on, but don't look at the dots for the moment, that the underlying sort of grayed out network is the kind of raw material for the spatial morphological analysis. So again, in drawing, it's an abstract representation. It's the least and longest lines to cover all the open space. But obviously, the decision of what scale you draw them at, what I know have from discussions with historians about what counts as open space, private space, public space, these. I think the important thing in terms of our dialogue is that the model actually doesn't try to impose answers to those questions. It's like, it needs to work in terms of your own research. It might possibly, this representation might not possibly work for someone else's, and I think that one of the useful things about syntax, because it's been designed with sort of architects in mind and that iterative process, you are invited to kind of basically tailor the model to your purposes. Of course, the other side of that coin, which you might find in a kind of a more sort of technical GIS environment, is there is some ambiguity there as to exactly how you might draw it, which can also be, which is, can be a source of inaccuracy. So, I mean, so if you then progress, go through, if you look at, there's one map which will be, say, 1850 or 49, depending if it's Sheffield or Manchester, segment, that in Run. Right, so that's normalized integration, radius n.
Has everyone found it?
Sorry, we should have numbered.
Do you want to hold that up? Actually,
yeah.
It should look like something like that.
Yeah.
So it's the people on. If there are any.
So the key. It's one of the. There's no dots. The key at the top of the legend, it will say NAINRN. Right. So that's a particular integration map, which takes the kind of street segment between road junctions as the basic node. And again, just to say, integration asks how close is one section of road to all other sections of road in the system, relatively speaking. So you would expect those right in the middle to be the reddest and the most connected, and those towards the edge not to be. What's interesting is, of course, when you're looking at a street network, there's lots of differentiation, and you can see how certain integrated streets actually penetrate to the edge of the graph, to the edge of them. The other graph, of course, it's not in this one, is NAHRN. Yep, NACH-RN. And this is another measure that's kind of the integration of common measures in urban syntax analysis. Choice takes every pair, and this graph shows every pair of road segments in the system and asks what's the shortest path between them in terms of the straightest road you can take. So if you can imagine it kind of, if you put all the shortest paths between all the segments, certain segments will have be on many shortest paths. Those ones are the reddest. And those which are on very few shortest paths will be the bluest, the coldest colours. We kind of talk about these as being integration as being to movement, as describing a destination. So where there's a lot of space, basically. And choice as being through movement between different places. And this kind of pairing of two movements articulated statistically through the integration measure and through movement through the choice measure are the kind of the sort of building blocks of the sort of analytical model. The final graph. And we're coming back to, we should go back to the buildings.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Do you want to say something about building types?
Okay. So if you're looking at one of the blobbly ones,
so
these guys. There's one that says building type, which should be the first one. Again, apologies for the colour codedness. We're not followed proper geographical conventions in the colour coding, and apologies if you're colourblind, it might not be as clear, but we're refining this model, so apologies, it's still a bit of a drag.
Yeah, these are working documents.
Yeah, but basically, maybe if you can just spend a couple of minutes trying to work out which types of buildings are in which sort of area, are there any patterns in terms of building sites? Note that this is just the data from the meeting, so that we might not have every single building here on the street plan, but are there any sort of patterns in terms of where things are located?
The good thing to do is to compare actually the two from the two cities. If you can see how.
What are these ones?
Just see.
They are exactly the same color. It's just that they're very.
Yeah,
That
anything
part.
that's light green is pub.
So there's not many pubs in Sheffield then.
That's not what the data's. Again, put your historian's head on. This is from my.
Oh no, it's different colour. That's why. Sorry.
Oh.
There you go. It's the colour is
Apologies.
different.
Yeah.
So these are buildings that you came across in your data set meetings.
Yeah. So
rather
these aren't
than
all.
ones.
No.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And how did you go about geocoding?
What colour's that? Sorry, I'm totally colourblind.
I know I am.
Oh.
Oh, okay, we're doing well.
Let's refer it's qualified to speak about.
What colour was that one then?
Layered maps.
These
on
colors
GIS.
are automatic. It's
Just-
program
I'll
generated.
just found
Oh,
the
that's-
corner.
Do you know what this one relates to? Is that just open
Yeah,
space?
manual.
That one?
Yeah, no, open space. I think not this one.
Well, that one looks different to that.
Some of them you can get
That's
trade
a moor or a
directors,
field,
which will
there you
tell
go.
you the address,
Yeah, this
but I
one.
still have to double check them because
They're
they
all-
might be
I'm
wrong.
not sure.
Are all these
But
like these?
as you can see, the
Are
first
these all the same
edition
colour,
OS
these
maps
six?
have got
Same.
all
They're either
Yeah.
pub or church. I can't tell the difference between pub and church ones. That's the problem.
For pubs.
Or are they?
Yeah,
in?
I
I think
trust-
this
I
must
trust
be
these.
pubs, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Obviously, for
The church
this
is blue,
map,
so it's
just
just one.
impossible.
See, I can.
Is that and that different?
Yeah, they are
Okay,
different.
Right. No, I can't
This
tell
is
that.
purple
It
and
is
this is
public
more
house,
on the
but
blue.
it's described as an in-and hotel, so
Okay.
pub-
No, I definitely can't tell
pubs
that
are
apart.
small ones, bachelor boozers, whereas inns would be kind of
At this amount of categories, they should be in different shapes rather than colors because it's not.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
which
Sheffield.
yeah, that's the
It's weird actually because from a colourblind perspective, that's really easy. I can actually
It's,
tell
it's
that.
a different thing.
No, I know because it's gone from blue to red. That's super easy. Most visualizations are impossible for me with these
The
colours.
thing is,
Yes, I
here's the
can see
But that
scale.
one's easy.
This
I mean, I
is the
think maybe
scale.
look
Here,
at the,
there's no
yeah,
scale.
yeah, no,
So if you put it
colours are difficult.
like, I mean, a gradient, the gradient by itself doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, true. You're right. Because too many. You've got different categories. Yeah. Do you have a sense of what's going on?
Okay. There's different colours and all,
But I think we have one with the colors. Did you print that one? That on the dots, we have the syntax values.
is that right?
Because then that's what they're trying to do. So
I'm interested in how this area is so differently represented in the two maps as well.
Yes, I mean, I think
sorry.
How this area comes out so differently in the two different scales. That's the thing that stands out, right?
yeah,
That this
Also
bit
the
is so
analysis.
connected, and then this bit just stands out as like an island almost on there, but not on here. Yeah, it's the other way around. That yeah, you know what I mean?
The thing is that they're measuring different things. This
Yeah.
is measuring integration. This was measuring choice. So here basically is how likely you are to go through certain
Yeah.
areas to get somewhere.
Yeah.
Whereas here it's about the destination.
Yeah.
And this is at a city scale, like in a global scale, not like depending on, I don't know, a neighborhood. So that's why in theory, in practice, actually, they're completely different
Yeah.
in terms of coloring.
But what's interesting though is that one looks like an island that no one would go
Yeah.
to in this one, but some other outskirts don't. I guess my point is that for an outskirt, it looks very different. Whilst the outskirts look kind of similar here.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think
Only
one
connection.
just sort of point is that the same space
Mhm.
can be represented very differently
Yeah.
and actually speak to different questions,
Yeah.
different depending on what if you're
Yeah.
trying to understand this as a sort of a day-to-day space, as a residential area. Its integration value would perhaps be of greater interest in some ways. But this as the choice model shows it as a space on the way to somewhere else, and
Yeah.
you put those two together, and it will start to help you can
Oh, yeah.
start to understand the space. And I think that's something I've found. There's a lot of these softwares produce a whole load of measures, some of which are useful, some of which aren't. And that's the dialogue we're involved with, at the moment. And often it's a question of the person who knows the space actually bringing a question, bringing a hunch to the analysis and saying, does that make sense? Does that useful? Can I use this to advance my interpretation of this thing?
Another thing, scale dependent. Besides the type of analysis, it really depends on the scale. They are interested in something at the city scale or at a neighborhood scale or, I don't know, borough scale. So depending on that, you run the analysis.
The last map is this these ones here, which just represent the 10% most integrated segments in the system. And the jargon in space and Pats for this is the integration core. So you, on the whole, you would expect these, again, the theory would suggest that the integration core is very important to bringing people in and putting people straight sort of into the urban environment. So something you can see, these are kind of key structures, and you can just look at the distribution of other sites, other happenings to that structure, which you can see is different in cities, Manchester.
And did you find that the different, like comparing Manchester to Sheffield and different characters?
Vaguely take.
Which will come to
The only thing vaguely to take is that
Is anyone
I'm
stuck?
assuming these things are older plots, right? Because they're more kind of warranty.
Right.
And things like these are
I
kind
think
of
the
the new
colours
ones,
are
when
proving,
they're more,
Yeah.
when it's more kind of
But
grid.
I think maybe just
It seems like the grid-like
the
areas,
comparison
fewer
between the two.
dots.
You look at the same map.
You look at
Yeah.
areas that look more like grids don't serve as many dots, but areas that look more warranty and more kind of turny, cornery, a bit more old kind of places seem to have. As long as being corners, you know what I mean? So like here, it's really interesting that those are there, but they're not in here. And there's like nothing here, and there's nothing in this bit here, but there is at the edge of it there. So kind of it's the areas that look like lots of straight line grids.
Yeah.
That don't seem to have
Yeah, there are
stuff.
quite a few maps.
Thanks for sorting out.
Yeah, from Manchester. Yeah,
I don't know if that worked. That might not work for Sheffield, but that seems to work
here.
here. I mean, there are warranty bits that don't have stuff.
No, for sure. But it's the other way around. It's like
Also,
the grid bits don't have.
Sheffield, I'm struck to the extent to which you need the topography as well. Because Sheffield's quite hilly, right? Sheffield kind of goes up and down, round, and it's in a big bowl.
Yes, actually, it's a good point. I mean,
Well, Sheffield's in like a big bowl, and so
in graph theory, what space syntax jargon calls integration is it's closeness, and what we call choices between and those, for historical reasons. There's
Network graph.
If you spot any patterns, I mean, the last one is crucial.
The dots on the final map aren't corresponding to the colours on the others.
No, they're coloured up according to integration. Yeah.
So they represent
Just to add that extra. No, simply. I mean, that's something, Katrina. I think we'll talk about. It's the building connects to the street. It's that measure.
This is a red.
So it's the same building suits, but
Yes,
different maps.
so it's had integration values have been assigned the street segments in this case.
Like, there's major roads here, there's major roads here, and the pubs are not on those roads, but close to them, behind
does
them.
that mean you can't be
It's kind of
vector often lays
but then as you're going out of town, they are on the roads, right? So as you're kind of exiting the town centre, you'd expect
over
that.
here. Here these are on here.
So like, I'm thinking like here in Manchester, I don't know what you got with the pubs or not, but you kind of expect on the way out of town you would have things on the thoroughfares because there'd be more,
Right.
there'd be less traffic on the side streets.
Obviously, try and snap things together and manipulate.
In the same time, the property is the premium thoroughfares, as you say, that's where most of the people
And in
go
many
west
respects,
to prize
you can run a model.
the wealthier people.
Yeah.
And
and you'll get.
So as you go out,
but I mean, what's important about the
There's a cluster here, which is clearly like on the edge of town. You know, there you're kind of like when you first get in the city, you stay for the night. You know, after you've got your carriage to town or whatever. They're almost travellers, taverns kind of places. Now you imagine people coming in from outside of Manchester and using it.
So yes, that's absolutely right.
I think the dots.
The moment
No, but they operate differently on this last map than on the others.
Yes, sorry, absolutely. So, yes, on the last map, the dots, the buildings have been assigned integration values, and they're coloured accordingly.
So these ones that are sort of outlined here and possibly close, you can see what they are.
Yeah, lower.
The thing that's in the middle of nowhere is it's going to be a field.
So Katrina, based on your knowledge of Manchester, where are those places I've ringed?
Oh, I wasn't looking at
These places. This is where
All the
Manchester's
places I kind of-
expanding into. So this is all speculative building. So this is the kind of city centre here,
Because the thing that
and then
struck,
everyone's sort of moving outwards.
because the thing that strikes me is the things that look more like grids are the places that have fewer
Yeah.
things, whilst the places which are more like chaotic city building are the places that have more meetings.
Yeah. By this period, you're moving into, this is all residential.
Yeah.
So if you read Engels' description, he describes Manchester as these concentric circles, and I think he's right. Where you have the commercial stuff in the middle, then kind of your theatres and your civic buildings in a circle. Then you have working class residential streets, the classic Coronation Street style houses in the circle, and then out there you start getting these middle class suburbs because people don't want to be appointed.
Where are the bridges?
There,
There?
one
I assume
there,
there.
and one there, and one there, one there.
That one.
Yeah, so the river's this.
Yeah, I thought so.
Like this.
I'm surprised by the lack of concentration around bridges, actually.
One reason, again, this is where you put your historian's hat on, is New Bailey Bridge is where the big prison is. So you wouldn't want to be having meetings around
Whilst
where
this
there's
is-
lots of
whilst-
there's lots of police and stuff.
Whilst that
But
bridge
then
is
it
not.
raises the interesting question that if there's the potential for a lot of, you know, that actually it demands that you think about the space in that way to identify that.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. Again, this will take you longer to try and visualise. I appreciate it's quite difficult, especially if you're not familiar with the city. But the purpose of doing this is to see, well, can we strip everything back and take away actually the historical context and see what we see in terms of the patterns first, and then put the history back in. And so that's our process again of working this kind of cross-disciplinary way. So now we're going to go back to some of our conclusions. You may come up with these, you may not do, but what we've been sort of thinking about is what do we now find out from these maps. So this is the Manchester data in terms of integration, and this is how it's all spread out. So the most integrated places are on the left-hand side, the least are on the right-hand side. So, unsurprisingly, places like the courthouse, the commercial exchange, squares are most integrated places. The mean is is the average of all places is there. The mean of all the streets
Including streets without meeting places.
Yeah, is there. Fields and moors are obviously on the way out because they're in the middle of nowhere, as you'd expect. So those are kind of things, again, that a historian would say are obvious, but here we've calculated it through looking at these measures. So that's one of the things that we've been doing with this data.
And in a way, it's quite pleasing actually, because it is more or less what you would have expected, you know. And you know, I think we don't really want to, you know, be used data in a completely, you know, way to in sort of an abstract way. Actually, we didn't want our moors to turn out to be very well integrated, but it suggested that we had a problem.
Yeah, so our preliminary findings, we've been doing 2 phases of this project. So the first phase, we worked with Panos, whose surname I can never pronounce, and then the second phase has been working with Berta. So there's slightly different foci in terms of what we've been concentrating on here. So this was the findings. The first phase was that all these political meetings, and this is just for the Manchester data, took place in places that have greater than average global integration, so places that in the global scale are more integrated, and also in terms of local integration as well, and are relatively accessible. So they are generally, and this is coming from a historian's perspective, where I might have expected more meetings to occur in hidden places that are less integrated and out of the way. Actually, these places are meeting places where it's more likely that you will have access to these sites. And this is in the era of from the French Revolution to the end of Chartism. So there's there's a lot of repressive legislation about meetings as well. So this is quite an interesting finding for me. Meetings that take place in locations of greater than average accessibility include local government meetings. Those are all the things that happen in the town hall, basically. 10 hours factory campaign meetings actually mostly occur in pubs that are in the city centre, and commercial meetings. So again, things about merchants and middle class meetings, basically, about taxis, things like that. Less integrated places, types of meetings, religious meetings, partly because some of the chapels are on the outskirts. Abolition of slavery meetings actually occurred in less integrated places, which was an interesting finding. Also, meetings in the 1830s. Although again our sample was a bit smaller, so that might have been skewed by a small sample. And less than average Irish meetings, which tend to occur in the kind of Irish areas, which would be those bluer areas on the map, so more ghetto-y, although I'm not going to use that term specifically for that. Patriotic meetings to sort of organise celebrations of the King's birthday, or they tend to happen in people's private residences, which might be the gentry's houses, which might be a bit out of town. Reform Bill, military, radical, other, and trade unions are the outliers. So trade unions tend to meet in places which are least integrated. So that was the findings from the first end of the project. So this is the last part of the session, really, which is where we're going next and thinking about phase 2. So this is some of our work in progress. And also, again, coming back to this theme that this isn't a ready-made project. There are lots of historical decisions to be made. You can't just plug in the data to the software and it'll come up with the answers for you. So some of the conversations that we've had, Berta will remember this conversation about boundaries. Where do we set the boundaries of a city? So this is me, again, in my rubbish QGIS, basically drawing a line of where I think the city boundaries end in Manchester, and thinking about what about these streets that tend to go out of the boundary? Where do I stop? Where is the end of the city or not? How do we then map that? Because we weren't looking at some of the places that were actually outliers, which happened in the middle of fields, and a lot of this, because we had a conscious decision to make this urban data only. So I basically just drew a line around places and thinking, well, where does the city stop?
I mean, I think this is a really fundamental thing as well, because a lot of, obviously, a lot of data is defined in terms of administrative or political kind of boundaries, and it's that question, what is a city? Where does a city begin and end? Is so fundamental, I think, historically, and I think again, it's the sort of question that this sort of approach invites you to ask and to have a really fascinating dialogue. I think because drawing on Katrina's expertise to say, well, where is Manchester? It seems a pleasingly simple question, but actually very difficult. And then you get a kind of spatial morphological as well as a political or an administrative or a cultural kind of response.
Yeah, and then the next stage of the project was to do a case study and drill down. So we've been mainly working on a global scale, looking at the cityscape as a whole system. Actually, now what we want to do is do some focused studies of particular areas. So Ancoats, which again is northeast Manchester, is one of the main case studies. And from a historical perspective, I chose that area because there's a concentration of meetings there. So when I just mapped the meetings out, there's a lot of stuff going on. And traditionally, again, if you read the various historical geographies and histories of Manchester, you know that that's an area of activity. So again, we wanted to see, well, is it well integrated or not? How do we actually do things? So that's an interesting map for us. So again, the red line is Great Ancoats Street. And again, you can see that that's highly integrated. I can't remember what integration map this is, but you'll see that there's lots of blue lines around and about, and this is mainly working class residential housing and some commercial shops, small shops and small workshops, which are, so the contrast between that very sort of definitive main street and all these little areas is something again that we found very interesting, and why that was. And again, this is Bartlett did a wonderful job in basically now sort of going through all the building plans. So we did again working out the best scale to work on. So there's all these decision-making processes about scale, how big should we make our case study, and then basically tracing the OS map.
So scale becomes an historical question, not just a purely technical, abstract one of, you know, how does the software work, and what scale is appropriate.
Yeah. So there's questions about isovists and lines of sight, which we haven't done yet, but we're working on. So where can you see from these places? I've been messing around just with standard historical geography, demographic material. So that's population density of the different districts. And again, you'll see that Ancoats is the most heavily populated area, so it's in the darker colour. So again, that's another reason why we chose that. And again, that's just overlaying that case study on there. And in reading and protests and things, you'll see that that's a crucial meeting point in terms of where the people coming from outside the city come into the city and meet that main street is a crucial sort of crossroads. So that's why we're focusing on the area. We've still got some work to do on thinking about the correlations there. And then finally, again, this is a work in progress. Sam thought it'd be a good idea to show sort of some of the conversations that I had with Bartlett over where things were. And again, it's partly because I'm really bad at mapping, but partly also these questions about where things are. So the little post-it notes are, I'm not sure where the entrance to this building is. So we're working on building entrances, and Manchester is one of those places where there's a lot of courtyards, and we were working on pubs that had yards, the way you'd actually enter the pub through going through a yard and turning round. So how do we actually deal with that in terms of space syntax when you actually have to go into a building and turn in? And again, we're still working on that, but there's again all these sort of nitty-gritty kind of decisions that you have to think about. Where is an entrance? Where do you draw the lines?
And again, it's not simply a question of finding the person who knows how to do that stuff, which is what, you know, see what I mean. It's a fascinating process of actually having to unearth a particular form of data and a way of thinking to connect your dot to your line in a way that makes sense, and you know, which is, you know, why I think this is almost as interesting as the kind of the results. Yeah.
And so finally, to conclude where we're going next. There's a lot of blurb here, but basically interdisciplinary. So thinking about how we can actually integrate our three approaches more generally. How do we analyse the structure of a street network so that it explains those social relationships? And thinking about the role of spatial data in historical analysis. That's it.
That's it.
Do we have any pressing questions? We are slightly over time, but I'm sure we can spend a few minutes with some questions.
Kind of question that kept coming up
and you're talking about the building entrances, I'm sure you've thought about this. Have you got specific days of the week for when these prices are being, and does that change the patterns?
I haven't looked at that data, but we do have it, and that's again one of the drilling down things. It'd be more difficult to do that with the global model, but I think for our case study, that's certainly something we want to look at.
Because you can certainly imagine when you're thinking of pubs in London, there are some pubs who want to try to have a meeting at on a Friday night.
Yeah.
And some that, a Friday night or a Saturday night in the city, quite quiet. So depending on that sort of information is necessary, and we might reveal something that hasn't identified.
Because I've done that with my own data, not thinking about it. The shift is that they move away from having meetings on Mondays, because Monday used to be the traditional day off in industrial areas, both in Sheffield and Manchester. And then with factory sort of mechanisation, Monday becomes a working day. So you see the decline of the meetings on Mondays. How that's replicated spatially, I'd be interested to know. So that is another thing we will do.
When you talk about connectedness, how much are you taking into account modes of transport? I'm presuming for this material, people are basically walking. The sort of technique have to be revised for, I don't know, 50 years later. I don't know about Manchester, but in London, when you've got lots and lots of local railways and cars eventually, and bus services.
I mean, on a purely sort of technical level, the graph can be represented at different metrics. So you can have, in the abstract, we often use the measure of 400 meters. So what is closest within 400 meters? What is the shortest path within 400 meters? So to represent a sort of a 5-minute or a 10-minute walking. And when these methods are used in an urban design context, that's quite common. So that's what you could sort of use them to have, if you think in what's 10 minutes walk, then you can sort of adjust the graph to do that. I mean, what's interesting using these in longitudinal work is that you find where you have an integrated line, then it's more likely to become straighter over time, and that usually reflects a endless incremental straightening, widening procedure. So that where you have integration, you get more integration over time. Certainly, the intervention of, where you have rail networks, you can see, with river infrastructure or the Sheffield's railway came along here. You can, in a sense, you can read that into the graph in the house on the street network. You can also, if people do work sort of weighting particular areas of the graph because it's a destination. What it is a kind of a way of thinking about the space people walk around, and you can do various things to it and ensure that it's kind of quite flexible on that level. I think people. For me, it works best when people know an area quite well. Because I think it takes that to kind of spot what's interesting. Actually,
can I pick up on that? What you said just kind of emphasises the architectural basis of this, perhaps rather than city planning perspective behind it. Actually, to achieve the kind of things we're almost talking about here, does journey planning and using the kind of network analyst type tools in GIS from that perspective actually start to answer those questions a bit better when we're talking about cities that become more complex, that are no longer just walkable. Then using route planning, there being a transit option between two places as well as a walking route between places. That would be the way forward.
Absolutely. I think it's a very one of the things some students in the Bartlett are very interested in is, mobile phones providing, you know, destinations that aren't kind of predictable because they're integrated or something. But the integrated spaces will still be doing something, you know.
Yeah.
So it's and the city was, so it's kind of looking at how those traces play out in ways. It's certainly, I mean, again, I think it's a question of, yeah, sort of seeing what, I mean, you have to come to it with a question and then take it from there.
So a very interesting presentation by Tom Bolton on his PhD about the way in which the superposition of where we're essentially in London occluded areas using spatial synthesis analysis. So you have the scales of mobility, which are kind of, you know, distance travel, disruption of the ultra local scale, but obviously dissemination around it. It's kind of very complex.
Yeah, no, it's nice. It's a really lovely piece of work.
I'm going to suggest this a little bit over time we draw this to a close. And before we do, of course, we just need to thank our, I was going to say speakers, but actually our facilitators, whatever word we want to use, for a really wonderful, interesting, provocative session. Before everyone leaves, I just want to point out we do have one final seminar in the digital history seminar series this term, which is a rearranged seminar, which is Lizzie Stewart from UEA, who will be coming down to talk about English designed landscapes between around 1550 and 1660. And again, some mapping work. So using 3D GIS to recreate prospects and promenades. So that's on the 5th of June. I hope to see some of you there and have the live stream running as well.
Thank you. Please do take these if you would like.